Thank you, everyone. Thank you. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Emma Smith to you, and I'm sure a lot of you know her work. Emma is a visual artist based here in Cambridge, but she's done a lot of work internationally, including recently at women's football. Here in Cambridge, she's exhibited in Fitzwilliam Museum. I think I got to know her first because of the work she was doing on Harper's Peace. And then last year she helped us when Cromwell History Society did a tour of allotments. And I'm really looking forward to find out how to predict the future and how to listen to the sounds of the earth. You may not find the answers, but I'm looking forward to it. Thank you very much, Emma. Thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for having me here. It's a real pleasure. I shall try and speak loudly and clearly. Feel free to shout or wave at me, come up and poke me, whatever. If you can't hear me, do just let me know. So I work as a visual artist, and within that I work within lots of different mediums. I work with installation, performance, sound work. I make some works which are temporary, ephemeral things, some works which are permanent, and pretty much everything in between. So I've selected a few works to share this evening that are about thinking about the theme of this year's Open Cambridge around artistic invention. I'm not going to claim that all the things are my invention, but there's things that I have come up with, because that's kind of what you do as an artist, is come up with things. But also a big part of my practice is working collaboratively with people, and so a lot of my work is about bringing people together to see what we can come up with and invent together. So I'll be sharing some of what in the art world gets called social practice, which is basically working with people to make things. So that's my website if anybody wants to look at any other projects afterwards. So those are all the different things that I do. Part of my work in Cambridge at the moment is that I'm working as artist in residence for Cromwell Road, which is just around the corner, making a permanent work for the Timberworks site, which will be being installed next year. So that's going to be the final work that I come on to share this evening as something that's happening locally here, and that's commissioned by Resonance Cambridge as part of the Cambridge Investment Partnership development that's happening down there, which is where Ridgeons used to be, for anyone who knows that better. So I'm going to start actually with a little project which, sorry, I don't know why I've said the word little. Anyway, a project which is a little bit outside of Cambridge, called Campanellagia, which was one of the first projects I did in Cambridge, and this was in Bourne, which is where my studios are at Wising Art Centre. And this was one of the first projects I did in the area back in 2011. Do we have any bell ringers here? No. Good. You won't know what I'm talking about then. So, I didn't do bell ringing before I do this, and a big part of my work is always looking at the histories of locations and spaces, and then thinking what's really interesting about the history of this place and space. And then quite often that leads me to something I know nothing about. And so there's always an exciting part in the way that I work, for me, of coming to a place, learning about its history, and then thinking, oh, great, now I need to learn bell ringing, or whatever it is that's kind of thrown up from the history of that location. So I got very interested in the church building in Bourne because it was a collectively built piece of architecture. It was built, as many buildings have been, with the village, literally collecting stones, bringing them together to make their church. And I'm always interested in collective histories. And I got interested in bell ringing because it is a new form of music, or is a new form of music to me, in that it works to mathematics, not to musical notation. So you work to numbers. If you start saying A, B, or C as a musical note to a bell ringer, they'll scowl at you and stomp off. It's pure maths, talking numbers, or that's it. So this is an example of what a bell ring score looks like. This is the score for 8 bells, which is what you've got at Bourne Church. So you've got 1 to 8 as your bells, 1 being the smallest. And so you'd ring them in order, and then this is a score that then allows them to change place and give you this is a very common piece of bell score that you would probably have all heard at some point wandering around anywhere near a church. I got interested in the maths of this because bell ringing has particular rules to how you can make a bell ringing score. So one rule is you can only swap places with a bell that's next to you. So you'll see that 1 and 2 in the second line swap places, so it becomes 2, 1. 4 and 3 have swapped places, 5 and 6 have swapped places, 7 and 8 have swapped places, but you're only swapping with the bell that's immediately next to you, because if you're swapping randomly with lots of other bells, chaos ensues and people drop bells and towers fall down and madness ensues. So that's a sort of almost like a health and safety reason for how bell ringing scores have evolved. And then the other rule, which is the interest geeky bit of mathematics, is you can't have a repetition of a line of numbers anywhere in a score. So the only way you have a repetition in this score is you've got 1 to 8 at the beginning and 1 to 8 at the end to return to that position, but every other line is unique. And what that does is means that you're just producing an extent of possibilities of how many variations of numbers can you produce with 1 to 8. Quite a lot. If you do a full extent on 8 bells, you can probably ring that in about 17 hours. So that takes quite a long time. Once you start getting into large number bells, that grows ridiculously exponentially. So the largest score I've ever written was for 40 bells, which was for Whitechapel Bell Foundry, and I have to write down how long this is because I can't remember it. So a full extent on those 40 bells would take 755 nonillion 610 octillion years to complete, which is that many times the age of the universe. So they get pretty long. I didn't write all of that because that would take me quite a while. So I wrote a section of a score that would be part of that were you to continue it with all 40. However, I should press on. So, what I got interested in with this mathematics is you can produce three-dimensional shape out of extensive numbers. So you can start to take the mathematics of a sound and turn it into a physical space. And what I got interested in thinking about is if you can do it that way around, if I can start to make a shape, this is like if you imagine a child can cut this out and glue this together, that's that original score that I showed you as a shape. That's quite a complex one. I had to work with the engineering department at Cambridge to get to that. There's no reason why you can't do it the opposite way around. So what I started to think is, could you take spaces and places as physical things with parameters and turn them into sound? So this is a score that I wrote for Bourne Church, which is basically taking a score that they gave me, finding that physical shape for it, mapping that into the neighbourhood, and taking all routes of public right-of-way from the church to the extent over which that sound could be heard, so this geographic space over which the church bells communicate, and taking that map of all those public rights-of-way and turning them back into a piece of sound. So this is a map, a sonic map of everywhere you can walk within the radius of the bells of Bourne. That was performed on the bells at Bourne Church with the ringers, lovely ringers there. And it sounds weird because it sounds like bell ringing because it's rung on bells, but it doesn't sound like bell ringing because it's not a score you will have ever heard. And so it has quite an uncanniness about it because you think, oh, I recognise that, that's just bell ringing. And then you go, oh, that's funny. Because it's just sequences that sort of disrupt what are age-long traditions of bell sound. Because we don't all ring bells, and to be honest, it's a wholly terrifying experience. And I, learned how to do it and can do it, but I still have the absolute fear when you pull this rope and feel this multi-ton piece of metal swing round, because they rest in the church like this, and then when you pull them off the stay, which is what you do to pull them down to ring, you can feel it come over the latch and go boof, and you think, I'm going to hold on, and it still gives me the absolute fear. So that we don't all have to have the absolute fear, I also made a set of hand chimes to tonally match those bells in the church that anybody can then have a play with, and they're in a sort of oak carved chest with the score engraved on the top. There's actually a whole contingent of people who love bell ringing scores for knitting purposes, because these scores produce lovely Aran sweaters as a side effect. So this was, and this is where I first came into contact with Whitechapel Bell Foundry, who helped me match these hand chimes to the tower, and that was what then led to me working with their foundry in the year that they very, very sadly left their building in Whitechapel, which is a tragedy really to British history. They were the longest standing manufacturing industry in the country, had been in their building since the 1300s, and they should have had national support basically to retain that building. But it was a joy to be able to make a piece of work that went into that foundry building and brought together the sounds of 40 of their bells from around the world to ring together in this, what could be a ridiculously long score. This piece actually got recommissioned in Bologna, where bell ringing is insane. So in English-British bell ringing history, in the Reformation, bell ringing towers got the floors knocked out to keep bell ringers in the actual body of the church. So prior to that, bell ringers were not necessarily religious. They might be actually quite anti the church. There was a lot of beer drinking went on. You'd go up into the tower, have a large cask of ale and have a really good time making a very loud noise. In the Reformation, church vicars not liking that quite so much, knocked the floors out, brought everyone into the church, keep an eye on everyone, stop the beer drinking. In Bologna, they're still right up in the tower, but they're actually hurling the bells physically. So you'll see they've got a little bit of, cotton wool in just for health and safety. It's very, very loud. They physically push them. If they're huge bells, they actually swing off the rafters like this on a rope and kick them. I was informed that in one church, just further down the coast, they were even more risky because they had open sides. So when they swung on the rope, they actually swung right out the side of the church and then back in to kick the bells. Wholly terrifying, but also quite revelatory because I hadn't realised how much church architecture moves when the bells ring. So the tower actually sways really substantially when you're up there with the bells in motion, and it's the safest place if we ever get an earthquake, get in a church tower, because they are used to swaying and they're the best architecture to be in. And you have to just keep saying to yourself in your mind, it's been here hundreds of years, there's no reason why it's going to come down today. So I was commissioned to make a piece in the city of Bologna, which, again, took a map of the city, converted that into a bell ringing score that meets the criteria of the mathematics. And this one was rung on 5 different churches across the city so that people came and walked the route as the bells rung their location, and then we all arrived at the cathedral. I hadn't quite appreciated the strong connection to the church still in Bologna in a way that's not so much in the UK, and so millions of people came, and we'd kind of planned this little talk in the cathedral, which is pretty big, and we were like on a lamppost shrieking down the road outside, absolutely rammed, but it was I'm the only female member of the community of bell ringers in Bologna, which is, good. Bit of women's activism in there as well. But it's basically totally mad. What was interesting with the mathematics there, so this was the score, the shape from the scores that they gave me as the kind of traditional scores that they rung on the bells there, and there was a set of them, and I started mapping the shapes from there, because the maths is old, so most bell ringers don't know about it, but it's somewhere in the invention of bell, in the histories of bell ringing, all these scores were written to this maths, and then everybody forgot about the shapes and just has these scores, but they have to, why the scores exist, somebody must have known about the mathematics, because the mathematics is very, very accurate and it produces very precise forms. And with this, what was fascinating is that it produced this lovely shape. You can make this little plan, but this line was missing out of the set of scores that they had. And I said,
what's the shape? What do you mean?
It's quite complicated. But say this is for 4 bells. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4 as your 4 bells. And if you just plot how many routes you have to have between the different various combinations, and then try and get them to join up in all of the ways in which they join up in the score, that starts to make a form.
Like a spiral graph.
Yeah. So in their collection of scores in the city, there was nothing that connected these 2 points in any of their scores. And I was like, no one's written this collection of scores accidentally and then missed a line. And so I wrote what would be the score that would produce that. We searched for it for ages. We searched in neighbouring towns and villages because often places nick each other's scores. Couldn't find it anywhere, so I just worked it out from the maths what it would be. And then I gave it to them with extreme caution and said, have this as a record, lovely, I think it may be a part of your history, but please don't ring it, because there are certain combinations that would make the tower swing more dramatically, and it's possible that the reason it's not in your history is that it would collapse all your towers. So just in case, let's keep it as a record and not ring it. So that's the, again, you can do it's quite complicated maths, but you can do quite fun kids' workshops with these things because you can just start to make shapes out of them. There was a comment, actually, when I was working on that project with an engineer in Cambridge that led onto this project I'm going to share next, HUNCH, from Cambridge, Alan Parker's piece, which was, I was working with an engineer called Tim Ridgman, who at the time was working in the engineering department, and he said to me, we have all these wondrous ways of assessing students and examining everybody, but always the best engineers aren't the ones that pass their exams. They're the ones that can suck their thumb and say, do you know what, I've got no idea why, but it just needs to go 2 inches to the left. And this really sort of stuck with me as an idea that actually, however much we learn and we have facts and we have knowns, there's hunches that we have. There's these things that we suspect to be true that is kind of tacit knowledge that comes from doing, comes from being in places. And I just love this idea of this importance of having hunches, and actually that kind of stayed with me and has stayed with me since then, and it fed into, in part, the development of this work in 2017. So in 2017 I was commissioned to make a piece of work by the University Arms Hotel on Parker's Piece as part of their 106 agreement with the council to make something on Parker's Piece, which is an amazing site to research, and of course a large part of that was with dear Alan, who is responsible for a large quantity of my knowledge of Cambridge history. This started as part of the research for this project by bringing back some amazing traditions from Parker's Piece, including the history of skipping, which was what we all did on Good Friday on Parker's Piece for hundreds of years, until the war, till the Second World War, but it was a hundreds of year old tradition prior to that, and so we thought it would be good to bring it back. And part of that is that it would have originally been a sort of pagan tradition of springtime ritual of leaping, fertility rites, but also then of just becoming this moment of stepping into the future and thinking about, how do we create this sort of point of departure for new things and new possibilities. And the whole project really was about celebrating all the things that have been invented on Parker's Piece, or tested out, or piloted, or been the location that lots of things have arrived in Cambridge for the first time on that plot of land. And I should be doing a walking tour of the piece on Sunday for anyone who wants to join that, which will go into some of those specific histories in a bit more detail. So we had a little exhibition in the pavilion which shared some of the history of the piece and of skipping on the piece in collaboration with Museum Cambridge. And then I invited Adrienne Van Heggie, who's the world jump rope champion, to come and show us how skipping's actually done. And she came and was excellent and did some hardcore, very impressive skipping. But it was great for getting everybody involved. So that was our sort of kick-off for think about how we might all together think about new futures and possibilities. You might recognise people as we go through. So we then spent a year collecting people's hunches, so inviting people to share knowledge of things that they suspected to be true but couldn't necessarily prove. And we collected those at Midsummer Fair with chips, with various schools and cafes and museums getting sent our postbox across the city, and just inviting people to make a little postcard with their hunch that they shared with us. They all got collected and then turned into an oracle performance that we staged on Parker's Piece. So this performance centred around the building of a hill, on the piece. Parker's piece is very, very flat, but actually historically that's not the case. 1600s, it was actually quite hilly and bumpy. There's lots of exciting histories about Parker's piece, which are kind of less known histories. It's got some really curious, amazing histories as a landscape, but it wasn't that hilly. So, you know, taking it a little bit far, but it was definitely not flat and definitely not particularly suited to sport, which is what it became flattened for. And so we held an oracle, the sort of invention of which was to create a future-predicting machine that sat in the middle of this mound that people could come and collect a prediction that had been collected from these thousands of members of the public, of residents in Cambridge. I think there was about 3,000 local residents and 800 students contributed predictions to it. And then there was 300 11-year-olds performed in it, which don't ever do that. It was great. It was totally brilliant. They were fab. But, you know, if you teacher training, class of 30 after 300 feels lovely. And then we were also referencing older histories. So we performed one of the oldest piece of written music in the world, which is from the original Oracle site at Delphi in Greece. And with Barnaby Brown, who's an extraordinary local musician, played on the aulos, which is what it would have originally been played on. And the students then produced this amazing piece of choreography around this serpentine dance, which this original score narrates. That's the part of the aulos you can see there. So we were doing this sort of big performance and sharing off the top of this hill oracles that were being gifted out from the centre inside this mound with some very beautiful old instruments. This was a gaggle of wise women, which were just literally a gaggle of wise women recruited around Cambridge, of anyone who felt like being in a gaggle and was particularly wise, mostly troublemakers, some brilliant people Cambridge is full of people who are full of all sorts of wisdom and knowledge about the city, and it was nice to be able to bring a group of them together who went around kind of helping people who'd received an oracle prediction question it, think about what it meant for them, and who open up these sort of debates in the space about the future and collectively what we wanted it to be. So this is the little machine that's inside. It's a globe. It runs off a Raspberry Pi computer. It has a number of questions that it asks you when you type in numbers, which in effect kind of allows a sort of historic oracle process of rolling a dice, but by you selecting numbers, and it has a program that then, through your responses to it, will select an oracle for you that gets printed off on a little ticket that you can then take away, and they're all written in hexameter, so they're taken from local residents' predictions, but I then spent some time enjoying myself producing them as hexameter poems to come out of this machine. And then I also worked with various charitable organisations and individuals across the city to produce a series of banners that surrounded the site, which were our imagined future of things that we sort of hoped the future might entail. I just wanted to show this chap because he's my best feedback I've ever had on an art project. This is Alan, who came along and basically said, "I've waited 92 years to see this." And I was like, "Thank you very much, great, very pleased." He came every day, so he's my favourite audience member. So the next project I'm going to share is Variations on a Weekend Theme, and this was for Kettle's Yard, which was staged first time in 2015, and then we produced a digital version also in 2018. Kettle's Yard, as you all know, is an amazing building and art collection and gallery, and I got particularly interested in Jimmy's interest in how and where we share art and the ways in which we see it. And so I spent quite a bit of time researching his archive and his sort of thoughts about how we each kind of come into contact with artworks. So when he lived at Kettle's Yard, he would open his house between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, and students were allowed to pop in, and they basically got a cup of tea and a piece of jam toast, and they could just come and sit and be in his house and be with the art that was in there. And it was an open house policy to sort of share that work. He also had a loaning initiative where students could borrow a work of art for a year, have it in their rooms, and give it back at the end of the year. When he was doing it, that was quite an exceptional opportunity because you could literally go and borrow a Giacometti or something. It was sort of a very valuable pieces of work which don't quite get lent out in quite the same way today, although it's something that the galleries still do, which is brilliant. And they've also extended it to be any student within the city from Anglia Ruskin or the Cambridge University, so it's a slightly more accessible collection process, and students do still go every year and collect a work. And it's really lovely hearing people's decisions as to how they curate their bedrooms with this work that they've been given access to at Kettle's Yard. So I really love this idea of art being something that we can share and all have access to. And so I started thinking a bit about what that might mean in relation to my work, which is often performative and social, and also where we might come across artwork. So for Jim, it was very much that, not many people would hang their painting down there, but he did, because it's really nice to see the work when you're sitting in an armchair, and thinking about actually how art is really lovely to come across in a domestic space rather than in galleries where you have to keep walking around being all serious and silent, and actually it's just really nice to sit down with a cup of tea and appreciate it. So I started thinking about what we kind of learn, what knowledge we share, what performative acts we have that come from and are shared in the domestic space. Before Kettle's Yard, Jim had lived in Tangier for quite a period of time, and he opened his home there to soldiers during the war, and it was the same principle that he brought to Kettle's Yard of having this space where people could come in and have a moment with art. But it was kind of a more extreme version of that almost, because it was about people being able to come in and that art experience being actually restorative and having benefits to health. And so I started thinking along those lines of, are there ways which we kind of have these health benefits and knowledge that come from the home that are performative that I can start playing on in terms of thinking about gifting artwork more widely. And at that point I came across a project that was being run by the History and Philosophy of Science department at the university, the Casebooks project, which looks at Foreman and Napier, who used horary astrology to treat people medicinally from the domestic environment. So they worked from their home, and they used all sorts of amazing charts to divine what different remedies to cure people from the home. So I got quite curious in this. My work often touches on lots of random bits of history. And so I decided, in the same way that I did when I ran HUNCH, that I would see what amazing domestic knowledge, curative knowledge that we had from homes across Cambridge. So working particularly in North Cambridge, started inviting people to share things that they had as advice from the home that they did for well-being, whether that be in a sort of very light touch way of actually I don't feel great unless I've gone and walked my dog in the morning, or I've been, long suffering from fatigue and this is the thing that I do. So it could be something quite definitely addressing well-being, or it could just be, actually I've not thought about it before, but I really like a glass of wine when I get home. And when we asked people to share what those things were, that restorative knowledge that they had, we kind of pushed people to think about the actual performative act of that. So if it is that you really like a glass of wine when you get home, what are the conditions of that? Do the lights need to be down low? Do you need to be sitting on a sofa rather than a hard chair? Are you in a particular position? Is it not relaxing actually if there's anyone else there? Do you need to be there on your own? What are the kind of real specifics of that as a performative moment? And so we ended up with a lot of quite precise instructions of how to feel good that came from people's domestic knowledge, and that came from people of all ages and from all different workshops and activities that we ran. Got some nice restoration, remedy and jealousy jokes going on there. And then we looked for somewhere to stage this as a work. This was all taking place while Kettle's Yard was closed for renovation for the new galleries. And so we were busy looking around the city as to where we might do something, and lighted on Maskell's Bakery, which is a kind of historic event in itself, really. Lots of people have very fond memories of Maskell's Bakery. and it was sitting there empty, had been for a long time, but the actual bakery infrastructure inside was all still there. So it had this kind of amazing interior that was a bit ramshackle at the back. That's the sort of central room at the back, but was just really ripe and ready to become an apothecary. So we transformed it into a pop-up apothecary, repainted the whole thing, refloored it, redecorated it, top to bottom, and the joy of Kettle's Yard being shut meant that I got to nick all the collection, so that was fabulous. So we got to take lots of the things that are in Kettle's Yard up into Arbury and have them in the local community, which was wonderful. And this was the original just Maskell's Bakery bread stand, but it worked very well as our little apothecary. So you could come in, and it was all free. You could come in and you could get a little free over-the-counter pick-me-up. We had pick-me-ups, little piece of advice for rest and recuperation, things to mend the heart, and you could just come in and you got a little pot or a little card, which was like a little gift, basically, but that just had a little thing that you could do that might make that thing better. And all of these were a sort of piece of advice from a neighbour, in effect. And so there was kind of became this sort of community exchange. And it was amazing. And I think kind of often galleries and museums think hard about how to get people in through the door and engage people. And just doing something smack bang in the middle of a residential neighbourhood with a glass window is the answer to that, I think. People, like we had just kids every morning, like, when are you opening? Coming in repeatedly. So the whole space was sort of dotted around with these various works from Kettle's Yard on each little nook and cranny. And then the main part of it was then this series of charts that I invented to divine your piece of perfect performance art for you. And so people would come, book a session, again, totally free, I'd ask a series of questions, and through that I would be able to divine what would be your ideal performative act for you, that you might like to go and do, and that you'd then be gifted through the apothecary. I don't know whether I could do it again, because I retained so much information in my head to be able to do these readings. But basically I produced, it was kind of based on the aesthetics of horary astrology, but then finding ways that I could actually ask people questions that I needed to know in order to be able to give them something that would be definitely absolutely suitable for them. So that included things around understanding whether somebody was, of an age of being able to drink, whether they wanted to drink or did drink, whether they had any particular faith things that I needed to bear in mind. There was kind of, lots and lots of different questions that allowed me to find something that somebody would really love without kind of...
Can you give us an example?
Yes. So basically, that's the chart that I would read, which had lots of different numbers and would allow me to ask people lots and lots of questions. And then after reading this process and keeping a lot of information in my head at the same time, I would get down to one number. And then with that, I would then look up in my book. So for example, this is variation 86. So I, in this instance, have come up with variation 86. And this is, these are all the things that I might speak to somebody about, which would be around age, gender identity, whether they would consider something that had alcohol involved in it, how much, and also there was things about on a practical level. So like, do you want, are you willing to consider something that might take a week, or do you want something that you can do in 30 seconds? Or, do you need to have something that costs you absolutely nothing, or would you be prepared to spend a bit of money on this thing that I'm about to tell you about? So there were all these different things. So this is one which was an instruction on how to make a very particular and ornate blanket. So this would have gone to somebody who'd told me they had a lot of time to spend and a lot of patience and all the rest of it. But you'd get then basically a letter. So this is variation 36, which is gentle movement, and it's an instruction on a gentle piece of movement. And you'd receive that as an instruction. Some of them were just written, some of them were annotated with drawings, and you'd receive that in the post following the consultation. So that would be written up for you, and you'd receive it at home as a gift. And those were to anybody, not just university people. So that led on to thinking about recipes, which is something that we all invent all the time. And another thing that we kind of amazingly, collectively have as knowledge of inventions. And this came about through the Kettle's Yard project because I was commissioned out of that to make a work directly for the HPS department because we'd enjoyed working together through their work on the casebooks. And so I produced this work called Recipes for Relationships with Leah Asprey. And it was a similar book, but this time full of recipes. And this was starting to look at older historic recipe books. In the 16th, 17th century, you get amazing recipe books. Those are kind of like diaries as much as they are recipe books. The Wellcome Collection in London holds an amazing collection. There's various ones in various archives in Paris where you just get these extraordinary kind of detailing of how to use food to foster and treat relationships. Particularly you get amazing things like, you know, if you've got a philandering husband, how to like stop him cheating through food but without him realising that you're onto him. And there's kind of these amazing kind of narratives and details of, you know, how to kind of cope with all these different scenarios in relationships that you can medicate through food, and usually without whoever it is you're feeding knowing what you're up to. And so, again, took this historic, amazing material and thought about what ways we do that now. And it's maybe something we don't necessarily think about. We don't think, oh, I'm going to give this to my partner tonight because I specifically want them to be doing this by 10:30. But actually, all of us probably do that in some way without thinking. So when you think, oh gosh, I've got lots of family coming over, what can I make that's a really good family meal that we can all get around and enjoy together? We do all do that. We just don't necessarily think about it. But probably everybody has a meal that's a kind of a get-together meal. And then maybe we all have a meal that's like our own comfort meal that we just really like making for ourselves because that's the meal that we just really love as a kind of more doted and looking after the self kind of meal. So we have all these things. So we again collected all of these recipes from across Cambridge and then held a meal where we took people through the kind of life cycle of thinking about relationships through food, from caring for newborn infants and children, through to caring for yourself, and everything in between, and with a fair amount of over 18 content. And so people could choose, within the menu there was, from the historic material, there were certain recipes which were gender specific, and so we obviously didn't, it was up to anybody which of those they wanted to try, so people would be informed on each course what this particular dish had been used for historically and for whom and why, and then you could choose throughout which bits you wanted to sample, which was the cause of a lot of hilarity going through, and it was for all ages. I hope I'm not rushing too much, but I wanted to share a few things and then give you some time to also ask questions. So the next project I'm going to share is Euphonia. This project actually hasn't shown in Cambridge, and it would be lovely at some point to find a way of showing it here, because it was made here and it was made through a lot of collaborations here. So this project premiered at the Blue Coat Gallery, which is in Liverpool, and it came out of a project which really is sort of centred around invention for many years that I've been working on. So I don't remember when it started, maybe 2014, 2013, 2014, I invented a language, which is a singing language, and it's a language based on the sounds that make us feel most connected with each other. And I ran a big piece of scientific research in collaboration with different researchers, looking at whether there are sounds that make us feel connected or more empathetic towards one another. And through this very sort of scientific process that we ran, we ended up with a series of sounds that emerged, which were almost identical sounds to the sounds that we all make as humans when we first start vocalising. So they're universal sound set, they're made by all human beings as we start to vocalise, and so there are kind of clear reasons why we might like them, because we've been making them the longest, they're very low stress on the body. But it was kind of curious that's what we came to in this process. But having invented this sort of sound set that produces this singing language, I then wanted to make an installation with that would explore further the way that we use the voice to produce human relationship. So we tend to speak and we tend to use words if we have the faculty of speech. But actually, what I think the power of speech is that it allows us to make music together. So at the moment, I'm doing a lecture, pretty boring in terms of our sonic experience. You're just listening to me blather on. But when we chat together as friends, if you're in a cafe or you're on the phone to a friend or at home on a sofa catching up, we will chat where one of us will say, oh, I was doing this the weekend, or I listened to this mad artist talking the other night. Oh, did you? Oh, really? Oh, no, never. Oh. And all that sort of sounds that we start to make when we're in social conversation, we do in interlocking patterns musically. We harmonise with each other, and when we start making the most extraordinary music, and we all do it, and from the research we've been doing, we do it even with all sorts of neurodiverse conditions, and it's an extraordinary capacity. And I think there's a kind of a thinking that we all used to sit around campfires and sing together, and now we don't. And unless you're part of a choir or you kind of make a big effort, then you don't necessarily have singing in your life. But I think we all do it all the time. We just don't think about it as song. We think about, oh yeah, we're just chatting. But actually, if you take away the chat and you listen to what's happening, listen to a bunch of, I know we don't know people nervous about going on the back of buses with teenagers now with COVID, but get on the back of a bus with a bunch of teenagers and it's like pure opera. If you just listen to the sound that we make together, it's extraordinary. And so I basically spent a long time eavesdropping into people's conversations with their consent by just leaving microphones in social situations, but then removing myself so people could be hopefully as relaxed as you can be when a weird artist has put a microphone on your table when you're trying to catch up with your mates. And just then recorded those chats and conversations, and then through a piece of computer program, took away the speech content and just left the musicality, the tonal intonation to hear what was going on. And so I wrote this piece of music based on all these conversations, which are primarily between Liverpudlians talking about all sorts of stuff, including what flavour crisps they like and where they'd been out the night before. It's extraordinary music. I recorded it with the choir of St John's College, Cambridge. And it sounds like pure classical music, and it's just people chatting. And it's amazing that we all do this without thinking. And once you start thinking about it, and it's just a thing to I encourage you to do next time you're just in a cafe, try and blur out to what someone at the next door table is saying and just listen to how someone's like, oh, really? And all the kind of ways in which we beautifully, and it will be harmonic and amazing. So I wanted to find a way that you could play that, record it, play it in a gallery where you're going to have it there for months, so you can't have people singing it because you'd kill them and they'd all lose their voice. So it was going to need to be a recorded version, but that would retain this amazingness of what it is when we come together to vocalise in this sort of relationship of sound, which is that it's a multi-directional process. So it's not that I start talking and then you come and join me in a chat and you start harmonising with me. As soon as I hear you, without me thinking about it, I will start changing, moderating my voice to harmonise with what I'm hearing, intersecting with that. So it's always everybody's shifting to accommodate each other. And so with this sound piece, it plays out of 8 speakers, and it has a computer program that allows it to listen to voices in the space. So there's a microphone in the room. It's not recording anybody, but it's listening to you. So it's not holding any of the information, but it's processing it. So it hears anybody's voice within the space who chooses to. And then the sound work will accommodate itself to harmonise with that voice that it's heard within the space. So it will, as a sound piece, it will adapt in the same way that we do as humans. And it has, the score is written, so the score's based on actual music from conversations, but it's been segmented and written in the same way that you might play a game of consequences, where you're drawing a head and shoulders and next bit of the body, but where any bit of the score can run onto any bar can run onto the next bar, which was one of the most complicated pieces of music I think I've ever written, even though it's kind of a children's game. So any bar can run onto the next, which means that when it hears your voice, it can choose which bit of itself is going to allow it to best converse with you, and it can seamlessly segue to that. So in the space, it sounds like a continuous piece of music. There's never a break because it works very fast, but it will have, you will, if you vocalised in that space anyway, have determined what comes next. And so as a score, it has the capacity to play out about 2,200 years of unique sound before all of our voices would have kind of run its length of extended possibilities. So people had a lot of fun messing around with it. So part of this research on this work was looking at how that sonic experience of the voice that's being produced to produce relationship as opposed to information transfer, how that affects us emotionally. So we had also an experiment running within the gallery space to invite people to share how they felt emotionally when they went into the space, or before they went into the space and afterwards, and to see what impact that had on people's sense of connection to other people in the space through the work. I'm always interested in how you make work accessible, and I often work in quite complicated ways in terms of thinking about scoring, but it's always really important to me that actually the outcome is something that's just very easy to get at and open to anybody. And so for this work, I also got interested in how these sounds that produce relationship have particular forms and shapes, and how we might learn to produce music scoring systems that are not about classical notation, but just about kind of improvised sound and understanding whether something goes up or down. And if you look at very early music scoring systems, you get these beautiful gestural scoring processes. And so I made a series of sculptures which are kind of handling objects that people can improvise the sound from, which if you were to play around with all of them, you'd get at the same score. But also this is a haptic robot, which was developed for another purpose within the computer lab at Cambridge University, and I basically kind of went and nicked it, repurposed it and rebuilt it into something else with the amazing people who made it in the first place. So they helped me recode it with the score for the work, and it basically has a series of little arm levers on it that take you through 8 positions of an octave, meaning that you can read the whole thing by touch as a score and perform it and experience it purely physically rather than needing to hear it. Looks quite chaotic underneath it, but it works. So that's it being performed at one of the openings. And it's very exciting, even if you don't read it fully. It's just a crazy moving thing. So this work's been shown in various locations, and it's also had a sort of more temporary version of itself built, where these 8 speakers, I kind of turn them into little people, and they've been popping up in various locations. So this was an installation of them for Art Night, London. And they just sit around and produce their sound, and the microphone in the space picks up on people and it plays out the same things. In the Houses of Parliament in Südtirol, where they also popped up, you can kind of see them sitting in various chairs. And we had a big choral performance in there. This work, it's funny looking through works and thinking what kind of constitutes an invention and what you share. And this is kind of really a very simple little game, but I've just sort of popped it in there. This was developed with freshers at Loughborough University, and then I've run it a number of times at Murray Edwards College. And it's basically a game for meeting people who you don't know. And it's something that we've run during Freshers Week as a space and time where people are coming together, for many people at a point in their life when maybe it's the first time they've left home. And then they're going into this kind of mad collective living environment where probably never again in your life will you have the same experience, where you're suddenly living with quite large numbers of people potentially, and people who you don't know. And I think one of the things we do when we meet each other is that we try to find things in common, And I'm always interested in the things that we don't have in common, because that tends to be much more interesting. And it's the thing that we're least good at dealing with, and we probably need to deal with a bit better. And in my view, it's the thing that makes us alive as a species. So we are all in common because we're all human. And actually it's in finding differences between us that we understand that we exist and we actually achieve a sense of self. And so it's actually vital, I think, to our being. And yet we're always thinking, oh yeah, I like that too, yeah, I've been there. And we're always seeking these things in common because those are the things that are comfortable and not stressful to us in any way. And actually finding differences are really important. And so it's a game of how to find, of meeting each other based on difference. So it's basically like a little board game, like the I've completely forgotten the name of the game now. The game of marbles. We have to get all the marbles off the solitaire. Yes, thank you. It's like that, but with people. So you all start off on board, and you have to all get off, but you have to get everybody off. And the way that you move is by talking to a person next to you, establishing something that you don't have in common and that is different between you, and that allows you to leapfrog around them to the space on the other side. But you have to the idea is that you think collectively about how you might get everybody off of the space. And it just opens a different conversation, because you're not starting the conversation trying to find something that's the same, you're trying to find something different. And so people get to know each other a lot quicker, because rather than saying, oh, I'm from Manchester, or yeah, I went there once, you go, oh, well, actually, I only went there once, and so I don't really know very much about it. And so you start to kind of find things out, rather than just assume, because obviously the fact that you've been to the same place, or the fact that you were born on the same day, whatever it is that you think is in common, or you like the same music, probably the reason that you like the same music might be radically different. And your experience of a place might be radically different. And so it's kind of finding those little details. And colleges have really liked this, when I've done it, the kinds of conversations it immediately opens up between people, and I guess the loss of fear that you have to be, oh yeah, I know that band, and I know the same as you, that kind of weirdness that we all have to somehow be identical. You can also go and shout at people from the edge if you want to, which is just that if you've got off, this is only really necessary if it's total mayhem, so these people don't probably need shouting at this point, but if there's a lot of people who are not, and somebody's got off, and they can help strategically from the side as to who might help who to get everybody off. That was the purpose of that shouting. So I'm going to finish on this work, which is N+2, which is the work that I'm doing here in Cambridge at the moment. It's been a joy. It's always a joy to me working on projects in Cambridge, because it's where I live, so it means it's the place I get to be most nosy about the history of the location. And over the years, from various projects, I've been kind of accumulating lots of different knowledge of the city, which has lots of holes in it. So it's always a joy to kind of, work with everybody involved in Millroad History Society and everybody else who knows probably a lot more than I do about the city. But I definitely will credit Alan for most of what I know. So the project that I'm working on in Cromwell Road at the moment stems out of various interests and kind of research in the city, but we're, there's our lovely Roman road that comes down and out of the city. I think it was a close-up area. So Mill Road, obviously, historically, actually, the route that kind of runs through to Cherry Hinton, that's a very ancient route through, but it used to be where, lots of it now still is footpath, but this road has been extended. It's quite unusual. Apologies if I'm preaching to the crowd, because I know there's probably people in this room who know much more about this all than me, so you can enjoy correcting me afterwards. One of the things I think is interesting about this part of the city is it wasn't always owned by colleges. It's had different types of history, which is not so common, actually, for large swathes of the city. And so you've got areas where you do have college-owned land, but large areas that was bought up by speculative developers to do something with, that meant that it's had a slightly different history to other areas of the city that have been more college-dominated. So in the 1800s, we get this kind of massive sell-off of all of this, what was arable land, into housing and building plots. So these are just a few of the sale particulars from the area around Romsey that I've been researching and working. You might recognise, I'm sure some of you live on some of these. There's Thoday, Phillips Road. And lots of these blocks of housing were sold off in big chunks. Then the developer would build 6, 10 houses, which is why you'll get kind of chunks of houses that look the same, and then others that don't. But I'm kind of interested in the growing history of this bit of the city. So it went from being these original field areas, and this is Barnwell parish, and there would have been a field that actually ran kind of up towards Christ Pieces, which would have served growing for the south bit of the city. So Cambridge is unusual because it had 2 growing fields. Most cities historically had one. It had one here to the south and another one, which kind of up where John's playing fields are, that serve the north of the city. And so it went from being these fields through to allotments that were then sold off in this kind of mad business sell-off. But you'll see, even as this happened, the sort of houses developing off of the Millroad area, it takes quite a while for all of the allotments and growing spaces to disappear off of this land. So you have Allotment Gardens, which is where I'm working on the Cromwell Road site here. So these are Allotment Gardens till quite late. This is 1938. You can see there's actually what was Ridgeons was a woodwork shop for a very long time, well before Ridgeons was a phenomenon. And you've still got all grow space around there, and also on the other side where Asda and all that complex is, that's all still allotments. And then that slowly gets built out. But we obviously still do have a number of allotments in the neighbourhood, which is where I've been and was working with the Society last year, looking at this history of grow spaces in the area. Allotments are really important spaces. They've had various popularity throughout their history, kind of fluctuating between being the fashionable thing or the needed thing to being out of fashion at certain points. But probably more than ever, we're at a point where we really, really need to learn how to cohabit a bit better with our plant cohabitors, because climate change is meaning that we don't really need to worry about the economy or anything else going on, because it's a bit game over, but not to be pessimistic. But it would do us well to understand how to be slightly better neighbours with other species that sustain our lives on the planet. So I've been thinking about that a little bit, and thinking about how I might work with this history of growing in the area and allotments. And allotments are brilliant, but actually they're very, very popular at the moment. I spoke to one person at one of the allotment events we did who waited for 12 years, I think, to get their allotment space. So you can go on a waiting list for a very long time if you want one. But also, not all of us have the time, energy or resource to actually tend an allotment. And so I wanted to think about how to kind of reference this history, thinking about how we might learn to appreciate more the grow spaces that we live with and can live with, but also to do that in a way where the idea of an allotment isn't about a bounded space, but a space of relationship or interaction. So in looking at, the allotments, I think allotments are great, aren't they? There's just so many beautiful historic features. This is the Burnside. We've got this old bomb shelter, which has been lovely, custom-diced into a shed, collaborating last year on our visits. But they just become this amazing kind of architectural, historical tours of the city with, you can go around all these allotments and find the interiors of chapels, all sorts of kind of weird and wonderful histories from the city that have been repurposed as bits of shed and irrigation systems. But for this project, I've started to think a little bit about the histories that are held within the space, or the knowledge that's held in these spaces from the perspective of the plants, because they've probably been there even longer than those old doors have. So I've been getting increasingly interested in the field of bioacoustics as an area of research and thinking about the sound spaces and the music that's produced within the natural world. There are a number of people who are working on thinking about what plant noises might be, where they might emanate from, what they might be, whether they are purely functional noises that you get when you get like air bubbles travelling up the holes within a stem, or whether they are something more that's going on within a communicative system. There's various people who've kind of looked at this in relation to fungi and the kind of different communication systems that we have under the soil that allow for communication between species, and the idea of the wood wide web, which I quite like. But this idea that plants do and can communicate amazingly with each other, and they can let each other know that they're under insect attack. They can let each other know that there's a drought problem. If you get a pipe with water running through a location that is completely sealed, roots will attack it. And it's not because they can feel the moisture, it's because they can sonically discern it. So there's clearly an auditory system in play that's kind of not that known about or not kind of fully understood. So I've been making various field recordings of different plants that are going into the Cromwell Road site to see what they might be chatting about, and then looking at how to make a piece of music from that. This is a work that's going to be installed next year, hopefully, and it's called N+2. N+2 is an idea of redundancy. So you get it in aeroplanes, probably most where you might have come across the idea. It's the idea of redundancy where you have multiple systems to do the same thing. So if one fails, you've got a backup. So in an aeroplane, you'll have multiple ways that the aeroplane can fail, because if one motor fails, you need to not fall out the sky. So you'll have multiple systems within the aeroplane that mean that if something goes awry, you've got several versions of the same thing that will kick into place before you're in trouble. And it's something that comes from the natural environment. Nature has all sorts of amazing forms of redundancy built into it. So it just on a really simple level, the way that all the veins run across a leaf, they will be structured in such a way that if the leaf gets ripped, there's another route. And that's why the veins will be in that complex map pattern, so that it can self-sustain itself when damaged. So there's all sorts of forms of redundancy in nature that allow it to thrive and persist for the extraordinary amount of time it's managed to be on this planet, that is completely incomparable to the blip that has been human existence. And in the meantime, as part of the research for that work, the commission started during lockdown in 2020, and so it was a very strange time to start a project when normally I'm like, come on everybody, let's do something together. And we're suddenly at home going, oh no, now what do we do? And so research for this work led to this piece of work called Foodplex, which is a concept or a way of thinking of becoming a piece of land, and celebrating the things that we don't normally celebrate when we're made, well, essentially if you're making a development, they're not the things that you celebrate, which is celebrate the small, the wild, the overripe, the rotten, the undesired and the redundant as absolutely essential for sustainability. And those have been things that's been fun for me to think about in this context of a commission. And so I produced a sort of series of practices and activities that people could do at home, but that you can continue to do now. But they sort of evolved out of that strange time that was 2020. And these are all on the Foodplex has a website where these are all on. And so Fertilise is a collection of recipes, which actually includes one from Alan Brigham, but which have been collected from people locally of things that they either grow themselves or that you can forage locally or that are very readily, easily, cheaply got hold of. As a sort of recipe exchange, disperse. They're all practices basically kind of taking from something as a knowledge that we might attune with, from the natural world. So disperse is a kind of practice of being in place, basically kind of as if you were a seed, and thinking about all the way that seeds travel and using that as a way of kind of exploring your neighbourhood that you might not normally do because you're not normally thinking that you're a seed. But that makes kind of quite fun ways of, it's not about being mad, but it's about just travelling in different directions that you might not normally think of going and finding new routes. Ripen is a reading list of material, which is just a kind of added to resource of books and reading and films around the research. Wilding, this kind of came out, I guess, of what a lot of people, anyone who had a child in 2020 spent most of the year doing, was just looking for ants in the garden. Just thinking about actually all the amazing nature that we live with in really close proximity, but don't necessarily think about. And I think we kind of often think about the natural world as existing in green spaces, and actually it's everywhere. You know, we're probably in a room with a lot of other creatures right now that we might not like to think about, but they will be here. And they're everywhere, and they, you know, all sorts of amazing biodiverse species love what's been kind of coined as the terrain vague, or these kind of like brown site spaces that are urban environments. And so that was a practice of kind of just finding and appreciating that. Creep is a movement practice, as is fallow, of just moving. Creep is to try and move at the same pace as soil, so that's pretty slow. And fallow is a sort of sort of replenishing exercise. So these are all on the Foodplex website, which you're really welcome to go and explore and try out. Work for Residence Cambridge will be here next year, and it'd be lovely to share that with you when it is. And I shall stop yakking, and if anyone's got any questions, you're very welcome to ask me anything you like.
Thank you, Emma. That's absolutely fascinating. Can you repeat it all? I've got to go back to the bells.
Mm.
But fortunately, we have recorded it, so it will be on our YouTube site for a short while, I think. Would you be happy to take questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyone would like to ask Emma or reference something or anything you can think of? Yes.
You spoke about music, but we didn't hear really.
I know, I was thinking that as I was thinking, I should have brought some sound bites.
Just a little bit of something, like where do you sing the bells?
They're on anything. Have we got Wi-Fi here?
Yeah, we do actually. We can Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
So this is not a sound bite, but it's a trailer, so it'll give you a bit of a sense of it. No, it's fine. It might have me jabbering now. So
It's interesting, the maths and the music, because they do Scottish dancing and the mathematicians really adore it,
yes.
because they can see the structure of the
Yeah.
letters.
Sorry, taskbar's broken, so to use the...
Hear that? So that's Liverpudlians talking about crisps down the pub. Very nice. So that's the words taken out, just the music of it, and the sounds from my singing language put in just to give it the actual pronunciation. The music is directly transcribed from the speech, so that is just people chatting rubbish down the pub.
So there's no over-interpretation?
No. So what I've done is I've taken lots and lots of different recordings, taken the words out, transcribed directly what that music was that they were doing, replaced the words with this set of sounds from this language that I invented previously, which was this set of sounds that makes us feel connected. And then I've taken, say I've got a group of people down the pub over there, I've got a family having lunch over here or whatever, and I've kind of placed them with each other in ways that they can intersect. But as lines, they're all doing their own thing. Let's go there.
You're obviously very absorbed and taken with both the artistic side and the math side. And I wondered sometimes, is there a clash? The time for me that struggle would be when you had your music that you had recorded as that missing line in the shape. Did you have a struggle between the magic of it never being played because it compromises the bell tower and the ability to play it on handbell and know what it sounds like? Did you listen to it in a different format?
Yeah, and I mean, that was kind of a sort of side thing that came off the project where I was just like, in the research of writing a map, like, because the work in that instance was a sonic map of the city as a whole, and it was just in doing the research for it that I came across the fact that there was this bit missing from the historical scores, and that was just about enjoying that collaborative process with people in space, learning about histories of what's going on and being able to go, oh, hear this. But I think there is that transfer. Yeah. I mean, I think the question I've had before also is like, because I'm quite interested in what actually is happening, where that sits in relation to any kind of artistic interpretation of something. And so, like, with that Euphonia piece, it's really important to me conceptually that is actually what people are doing down the pub, because that's what's exciting and extraordinary about it. But that's a weird way to make music, because I'm not actually making music, I'm just listening. And so there's always this kind of weird process of where the artistic side of it comes, and for me that is mostly in the kind of weird idea of going, I'm going to just attend to this weird little thing that I found, and I'm going to pull some other weird things into it and see where that goes. And then kind of the creative side of it then also is in those things of, well, actually, you know, I've got X amount of material that is down the pub, but then I've got I've got, you know, hundreds of other people doing all their things, and I need to figure out how these things kind of sit together. But I think there's definitely I could be lots of other things, but the term artist is the most vague that I can find, and so it allows me to do things that I would like to do. Whereas if I called myself a scientist, I wouldn't be allowed to do half the things that I do.
Artist, engineer.
Yeah, and as soon as you use any of those terms, you just have to do things properly. There's all sorts of things you have to do. Whereas if you say artist, you can basically do anything. No, I don't have any qualification in anything that I do. I've got a BA in art. I'm very underqualified in all ways, but I do know quite a bit about a lot of random things. Yeah.
So, am I right in thinking that with the material you recorded to make that piece, you could have taken it in any number of directions, but you've chosen to end up with what you have done, like sort of using the material which could be assembled in different ways. Is that right?
So I think with the Euphonia piece, what would be of interest to me, for example, would be to record that in another country, to run exactly the same piece somewhere else in a completely different set of languages. So when in Liverpool, which has a large number of languages, the conversations there that are entailed in there are in English, Japanese, Punjabi, Arabic, French. Like, I think there's about 8 different languages that are within those conversations, but they're all 8 languages which are that are from people who are living in the UK with English as either an additional language or a first language. So it would be of interest to me to remake that work and to see whether you've got a different sound by doing it somewhere else, or whether actually, because I think what I was interested with when we did the research for that project, so in making that work, I worked with Ian Cross, who heads the Music and Science Research Centre at Cambridge, and with Robin Dunbar, who's Emeritus Professor of Psychology at Oxford, and Lauren Stewart, who runs a similar project to Ian, Music and Brain Research Centre at Goldsmiths in London. And we ran a number of experiments to make this work, and one of which was looking at whether the music that we make that produces relationship in conversation, that isn't about me telling you where I am at 7 o'clock, but is me going, woo, so that you go, ah, and then we like feel good together. Whether that translates across cultural linguistic barriers. And so one of the tests that we did was an experiment run between the UK and Spain, working with people who didn't share that other language, to see if they could tell whether if you listen to a conversation which has just been notated sonically rather than with content, can you tell whether that is a disagreement or an agreement? Can you tell the nuance of that? Can you tell if that is somebody who is saying they agree but actually they don't? Can you tell the difference between somebody who's having an argument and somebody who is having an argument, but they're actually married to that person, they would like to stay married to that person, they're very invested in that relationship? And so what are all those kind of nuances of what we're doing when we're talking to each other that are saying all sorts of things that we're not actually saying? And can we read that across language barriers? And what we found in our research, and we've published on this, is that you can, and that you can discern all those things without any shared actual language, and you can discern it really, really well. So you can discern that just as well, somebody who doesn't share your language at all, somebody does. And the only thing that we find really difficult to discern when someone's doing is when they are maliciously gossiping. And we don't really know what to do with that sonically. And I think the reason is because we're saying something pretty nasty, which is antisocial, but we're saying the nasty thing in order to bond with the person we're telling it to. So there's these two sort of contradictory things going on within our voice, where we're doing something nasty and nice simultaneously, and when you listen to that just sonically, we don't know what's going. We can't tell what it is, and that's the only thing that kind of confuses people.
Interesting, because different languages have such a different character. I'm thinking of a time in China. I don't speak any Mandarin and Chinese, but everything sounds really angry and attacking. But if you understand it, it isn't.
So a large extent of those cultural differences will come from volume or intonation. There's certain things which are not to do with pitch alteration, which create those kind of cultural differences. Like really simply, even in within English in the spoken world, like to tell somebody that you've ended a sentence in English, you tend to drop the voice at the end of the sentence, and in Australian you'd raise it. And so we have these different, so we have these different things that we do that are signifying what we're doing with the speech. What was interesting in the first piece of work I did prior to Euphonia, which is called 5 Hertz, which was coming at this language set, was actually lots of the sounds that we found that people had this sort of used to produce an empathetic response or relationship were ones that are shared. So, for example, ma was one of the sounds, and that's the word for mum in Mandarin, same as it is in pretty much every language on the planet. And it's just because that's what babies can manage. They open and they go ma. And so that's how that's evolved then into that word. And so we have actually these sort of shared sets of sounds that are a more universal sound set, which is what that word uses. But I've not done enough testing of this to know for sure. You know, that's why this would be a huge interest to me to be able to rerun this in a completely different language set.
Not in the UK.
Languages have different qualities, don't they? I mean, you think of some of the guttural languages that, or like Arabic, or even something like you can't compare Finnish and.
They don't necessarily. When you listen to them musically, they have strange things. They have strange things in common that you wouldn't think. Like there's languages which you would listen to in speech and think, oh, that's radically different to this. And then when you look at them sonically, you'll find that things that you thought were really disparate are actually very proximate, and things that you thought were proximate aren't. And so there's all sorts of kind of unexpected variation, I think, in terms of which bits that we listen to. But for sure, and again, with that experiment we did where we looked across Spanish and Chilean Spanish also, and English, I would be interested again to run that multiple times in multiple languages and to see what comes from it. But it's exciting
Emma,
to me that you have
that.
that.
On the website, could Gabriella, for example, look at other references to the linguistic work that you could?
Yeah, the paper that we wrote on it, which was headed, the main investigator on that was Robin, but it was our whole team that put that. That's not on there. So if there's particular things where you'd be interested in that kind of
Is that Robin
more
Dunbar?
science of it, yeah.
Can we, yeah,
Can I ask you about your lovely sonic railings? If I understood that correctly.
Railings.
Yes, so that's based on the sound from plants.
Yeah.
So you showed us the Bandle Fields, and I'm doing some of the project the other side of the railway line, which is slightly earlier. I think the allotments are mostly starting to be built over by the 1870s, and all the other sides is 1890s. Have you been able to go kind of deeper in and find out what was being grown on those allotments in the 1890s, apart from potatoes, which we know about, but to figure out what kind of sounds that might come from that heritage from that time of the allotments?
I'm trying to think what records
Or what
I've
were
got.
you choosing to make the sounds
So,
from?
so the plants I've been looking at are the plants that will actually be on the site.
Oh,
So
okay.
I've been, which is where the layer of redundancy comes in, so that I'm making an artwork that is to produce the music of these plant species and what's going on, but actually, if you just stuck your head to the floor, they would also be doing it. So if someone takes my work away, it will still be there.
Oh,
So
although if it's in the ground, there will be.
you won't, I mean, you won't be able to hear it in reality, because in order to hear it, I've been having to use a very weird bat recorder, which listens to sounds in all sorts of frequencies that we definitely can't hear.
Yeah, no, it's
but it will
such
be
a
there.
lovely idea. Lovely idea.
So thanks very much, Elaine. Thank you, particularly Emma. It's just a little present to give, just a token of our appreciation.